This is the iCAN KLR-4924, a new mousepad from iCAN, Canada Computer's in-house brand. Now normally I'd ignore a pad like this, especially given its price, but because of a post by NCFPS on Twitter who claimed it was an Artisan Zero clone, it grabbed my attention, so I went to my local Canada Computers, picked one up and started testing this pad, and in all honesty this is a really solid pad, but it does have its caveats though. Now just to be clear, I don't like clone pads, and for ethical reasons I usually avoid talking about them, but this is the first time we've ever seen a big box store like Canada Computers sell their own in-house clone of a premium mousepad. And that alone in my opinion makes this pad worth talking about, especially considering how well this pad performs and how cheap it is. That said though, if you do try this pad and like it, please go buy a real Artisan Zero to support the people who actually made it, not the big box stores selling a cheap copy of it, as the real Artisan Zero not only performs better, it is also a much higher quality pad. So despite this being a clone pad, in today's video we're going to take an in-depth dive into the iCAN KLR-4924 and go over this pad's pros and cons and see how it would stack up against a genuine Artisan Zero. But before we jump in, if you enjoy this video and want to see more mousepad content like this, don't forget to leave a like on this video and get subscribed to the channel. And just to be transparent, I currently work for X-Ray Pad as their media rep. Because of that, I've stepped back from covering mousepads since I feel like it's a conflict of interest, but the situation here with this iCAN pad is unique, so I wanted to make an exception to cover it, but to be clear, my work with X-Ray Pad won't affect my thoughts or opinion in this video. But with all that out of the way, let's get right into today's episode of the mel0n Review. For testing parameters, I used the pad for about 2 weeks straight, daily driving it for both work and gaming use. For skates, I tried several different shapes and materials, but for most of my testing I stuck with the X-Ray Pad Obsidian Donuts, and for sensitivity I tested the pad in my usual range of 40 to 50 cm per 360. For versions, the iCAN pad only comes in one size, a 490 by 420 by 4mm. It's also available in one color, and orange, which is a shade that's really close to the original Zero's color, just a little bit darker. And for pricing, this pad goes for a ridiculous $16.99 Canadian dollars, or about $12 USD, but the catch is that this pad is only available in Canada, since Canada Computers doesn't ship to the United States. So if you're outside of the Great White North, availability for this pad is going to be pretty tough. Now, despite the budget-friendly price, this pad actually comes flat-packed, which is great to see, especially considering the base type this pad uses. Now, speaking of the base, iCAN makes some interesting claims on the packaging, as they advertise the pad as being zero latency and having a zero fabric top, whatever that's supposed to mean, and they even call it a pour-on gaming mousepad. Now, that last one specifically is just flat-out wrong, as the pad uses a standard rubber base, not a pour-on one, and to add to that, pour-on isn't even called pour-on anymore, as it was rebranded to SlimFlex a while ago, and if the pad actually used the proper material they would have listed it properly. Now, my guess as to why the product box has so many interesting claims on it is that iCAN didn't really know how to market a gaming mousepad, so they just googled a bunch of gaming mousepad related buzzwords and slapped them on the box. But either way, the pad itself still performs really well despite the interesting claims on the packaging. Now, inside the box, all you get is the pad itself, and there is no protective wrapping around the pad, which given the pad's price is expected. But on the plus side, it's very easy to take out and just as easy to repackage the pad in the packaging, so transporting or storing the pad is going to be very easy. And once again, the flat pack design is a huge plus, as the rubber base avoids the creasing and warping issues you commonly see with rubber based pads that are rolled in rectangular packaging. Now, due to the pad's surface weaving and the way it's packaged, I would highly avoid reverse rolling or rolling this pad at all, as doing so could damage both the surface and the base layer. So if you need to transport or store the pad, make sure you keep it flat packed, and I recommend holding onto the packaging so you have some way to safely store and transport the pad if needed. Now for in-game performance, overall I have to say I'm pretty impressed with this pad, especially considering that it's a clone and its price and of course who's selling it. It reminds me a lot of the IKEA pads, which are priced low but perform well above their price point. Now from my testing across all the games I tried the pad in, the pad performed very consistently, and I didn't notice any issues on 3395, 3950 or 3970 series sensors, which was honestly quite surprising. The pad's performance profile leans more into the faster side, falling into what I'd call a balanced speed speed category that makes it great for dynamic and tracking aiming, but surprisingly it also handled more static and flicking style aiming really well, which is a nice bonus. That said, the pad's surface weaving and non-standard material make it deviate in terms of performance a bit from what you expect from a typical Zero clone, as the surface has a slight bit of roughness to it and it can tug on arm hair, and it has a few other quirks to it. Because of this, I'd highly recommend using an arm sleeve with this pad, and later in this video we'll go into more detail into why sleeves help and what types are compatible, and we'll also talk more about what to expect from the pad's surface in terms of performance profiles with different skate types. Another unique aspect to this pad is that it has a very unique base, which is kind of a hybrid between two other base types, which does make it perform differently from a traditional Zero as well, and due to the pad's nature being a clone and low price, I do have some concerns about quality and consistency between batches and of course the long-term durability of the pad. But overall, I am really impressed with the iCAN KLR-4942, and while I'm not a fan of clones from an ethical standpoint, it's hard to deny the value here. I've actually never seen a pad this cheap perform so well, as it even beats the IKEA pads in my opinion. That said though, the pad is still not the same as a real artisan Zero, as the quality and performance aren't on the same level as a real artisan pad, so keep that in mind, but for its price it is a very impressive pad. Now for build quality and QC, since this is a clone pad, which I suspect has been made by ATK or another clone OEM, the build quality is naturally a concern here, and this pad won't have the same attention to detail or overall quality as you get with a real artisan Zero. That said though, the build quality on my retail unit is actually pretty good, as the surface is clean and the edge stitching is quite well done, and even though the surface uses a very unique stitching type, there are no inconsistencies with the surface's weaving, which is pretty impressive for a clone pad. The QC the pad is solid as well. The only issues I noticed is that there was a small discolored spot, which is probably caused by some spilled dye, but it's purely cosmetic and doesn't affect the performance at all. And I also noticed that some of the edges of the pad were a little tight in terms of stitching, so it caused the edges to warp a tiny little bit, but this is again purely cosmetic and never affected the performance of the pad. Even so, while my unit's QC and build quality were quite good, I still have some doubts about consistency between batches and the pad's long-term durability, so if you plan on trying this pad, make sure to inspect it thoroughly for any loose or damaged stitching, and luckily Canada Computers has a 14-day return window so you can easily return or exchange the pad if there's an issue. But one word of caution, be very mindful with open box pads here, as they've likely been returned for cosmetic or quality issues, so keep that in mind if your local store only has open box stock, and if you have to purchase an open box pad, make sure you inspect it thoroughly. For softness, unlike a real artisan Zero which comes in extra soft, soft, and mid-base options, this pad only comes in one firmness, but interestingly enough the product box and the page don't actually specify what that firmness is. Now it seems that this might actually be intentional, because the base is a little bit unusual as I mentioned earlier. It feels firmer than a typical soft base pad, but not as firm as a traditional mid-base. Basically it's kind of a hybrid between a soft and a mid-firmness base in my opinion. On paper, this hybrid base gives the pad a slight range of control variability, but in reality it's really hard to take advantage of, as the amount of pressure it takes to utilize this slight range of control variability is way higher than the pressure you'd ever be able to use during normal use, and this kind of cancels out any benefit from this slight range of control variability. As a result, this pad sits on the faster side of the performance spectrum as I mentioned earlier, and we'll dive more into its performance profiles a bit later in this video. For surfacing, unlike the real Artisan Zero which uses 100% polyester for a softer, smoother feel, this pad has a tougher, more abrasive surface material which feels very similar to Amundsen fabric, the material X-Ray pad uses on many of their pads. Unfortunately, neither the product box nor the product page lists the exact fabric type used here, and I wasn't able to get an answer from Canada Computers, so I'm left to guess as to what this material might be. It might be Amundsen or it might be a composite fiber like the ATK Sky. Either way, it's not 100% polyester, which means it will perform differently from a real Artisan Zero, and we'll talk about these differences in a moment. But despite the different surface material, the surface weaving is almost identical to that you'd see on an Artisan Zero, as it uses the same circular hook-like weaving that kind of looks like chain links, which on the surface layer runs linearly across the pad on its x-axis, and the pad also has an underlayer of weaving which runs linearly across the pad's y-axis. Now, unsurprisingly, this weaving style does create a small variance between between the X and Y axis frictions, as movements along the X axis or horizontally across the pad go along with the surface layer's weaving, giving it a faster glide, while movements along the pad's Y axis vertically move against the linearity of the weaving, resulting in slightly increased friction. Now, because this pad uses a more controlled, rougher material, not the low friction polyester that the Real Zero uses, the difference between the X and Y axis friction is more noticeable here. On a Real Zero, it's barely perceptible. That said, the difference is still minimal, and most users will get used to it after a day or so. At first, though, you might notice this slight inconsistencies due to the unbalanced frictions. And before we move on, one last note regarding this pad's surface. The rougher surface material combined with the unique weaving gives this pad some textural feedback and a slight degree of abrasiveness to it, which might irritate some users' skin, but an arm sleeve can easily nullify this, and again, we'll talk more about arm sleeve compatibility and what types work best later in this video. Now for the pad's performance profiles, the pad's mid-soft hybrid base, unique surface weaving, and higher friction surface material all combine to give the pad a slightly different profile than a real Artisan Zero will have, falling into the balanced speed performance category, which is more controlled than a real Zero. But as expected, this performance profile will change slightly depending on the skates you use, as with traditional PTFE skates like most Mice's stock skates, the pad has a low degree of initial and braking frictions and a low to medium degree of dynamic friction, which keeps it squarely in the expected balanced speed category, whereas with more control-oriented hardened PTFE skates, the frictions increase slightly, with initial and braking frictions rising to a low to medium degree, while the degree of dynamic friction also increases to around the medium range, nudging the pad's performance profile more towards balanced control. And with speed-optimized skates like Glass, the pad's friction drops significantly, with the degrees of initial, braking, and dynamic frictions all going to the lower ranges, shifting the pad's performance profile closer to the speed category, more akin to the performance profile you'll find on an Artisan Zero with a mid base. However, it's worth noting that because of this pad's unique base and weaving style, it is only compatible with certain skate shapes and types, and we'll cover the compatible types in a moment. But regardless of what skates you use, the pad's performance profile generally stays around the balance category, just slightly more controlled or speed optimized depending on the skate type. But overall, I think the pad's performance profile is well rounded. Again, it is best for dynamic and tracking aiming thanks to its balanced nature, but it can also hand static or flicking styled aiming, which makes the pad compatible with a wide range of aim and game types, closest matching the performance profile of an Artisan Zero Soft, which is the kind of basic version of the Artisan Zero, but the pad will still be faster than an Artisan Zero with an extra soft base and slower than one with a mid base. But given that this is a clone of an Artisan Zero, it's expected that they'd match the performance profile of the soft base version, which is the most popular one, but again, due to the differences in the surface material and the base type, again, its performance profile won't be the exact same as a real Artisan Zero pad. For skate compatibility, as I mentioned earlier, the pad's slightly rough surface and unique hybrid base make it a bit different from pads with traditional bases in terms of skate compatibility. Now, in terms of materials, PTFE, hardened PTFE, UH, MWPE, gem, glass, metal, and ceramic skates all work well here with the pad, but keep in mind that more exotic materials might affect the pad's performance profile more than more traditional materials will. Now, when it comes to skate shaping, larger surface area full-size skates, 9.5mm donuts and 8mm dots or donut skates are fully compatible with the pad, but smaller surface area stock skates as well as 6.5mm dots and donut skates are not compatible with the pad, as their smaller surface area can't properly counteract the slight softness of the base, causing the bottom of your mouse to make contact with the pad's slightly abrasive surfacing, creating a rather unsettling scraping and scratching sound. Because of this, and for the best experience and performance, I'd stick with the compatible skates I just mentioned. Another skate related note I wanted to make here is that because the surface has slight roughness, standard skates will give you a little bit of textural feedback when gliding your mouse across the pad, and some users might find this physical feedback a little irritating, so if you want a smoother glide here on this pad, I'd recommend using skates with a buffering layer like the Unusual Way Sports Silver Fox, X-Ray Pad Air or Ultra Series skates, Ghost Glide Cyclone Pros, or any other compatible skate that have a buffering layer, as they'll give you a much smoother, less textured glide here on this pad. Now for base, aside from its unique hybrid firmness, the pad doesn't actually use a pour-on base as I mentioned earlier, and despite what the packaging claims, as it is a rubber base featuring the traditional zigzag texturing across it. Now historically speaking, rubber bases have gotten a pretty bad reputation compared to pour-on or slim flex bases, which is because they often come rolled, which oftentimes causes the edges of the pad to crease upwards and curl, leading to performance issues with the base since it doesn't sit completely flat. But since this pad is flat packed, the rubber base sits completely flat out of the box, meaning it has none of the issues we commonly see with rubber bases and anchors the pad really well. Even with your whole arm resting against the pad stays in place, and during my testing I never had any issues with the pad shifting or moving during use. But while this base does perform very well, it's still not on the same level as a true slim flex base like the ones used on the real Artisan Zeros, but for most users and considering the price, this base performs really well. Now for edge stitching, this pad uses a pretty standard implementation as the stitching has the expected roundness to it and its height is roughly even with the pad's 4mm height. Now some of the stitching is slightly warped or uneven as I mentioned earlier, but this is purely cosmetic and never affected the performance of the pad, but it is still something I still wanted to mention. But one notable thing about the edge stitching here is that the material is much softer and lower friction than the pad's surface material, and combined with the roundness of the edges, the pad's edge stitching doesn't add any additional drag to movements across it, unlike the pad's surface which has a lot more friction to it. In terms of the effects of moisture, since the surface material is unknown, it's hard to predict exactly how humidity, sweat, and other environmental factors will affect this pad, but since it's currently only sold in Canada, I'll give a rough estimate of my experience, but keep in mind that the environmental effects on this pad will vary in other regions and climates. Now for humidity, the pad seems to be mostly unaffected in my case, but direct contact with moisture however has a noticeable impact, as the surfacing seems to hold on to moisture more than expected, which is surprising given the gaps in the surface's weaving. Now any areas where the surface does hold on to moisture does create a slow spot on the pad, and these slow spots are oddly much slower than I've seen on other pads that use Amundsen or polyester surfaces, which is quite unique. Now if you have sweaty hands or arms, you'll likely run into issues with these slow spots forming on the pad surface, and to prevent this I'd strongly recommend wearing an arm sleeve as it keeps sweat off the surface and maintains consistent performance. But given the pad's unusual reaction to moisture, I expect that in more humid climates the surface would slow down even more, but again this will vary on a lot of factors, but at least for usage here in Canada, keeping sweat and other moisture sources off the pad is the key for consistent performance. Now for dust and debris, because the surface weaving is a little looser with gaps around the stitching itself, this pad can be quite susceptible to dust, debris, and even arm hair, as hair can get caught in the weaving, lodging debris into the pad surface, and in some cases even tugging on your arm hair. Over time, this means that this pad will likely accumulate debris inside it, which can affect performance and even cause some discoloration if it's not cleaned. As such, I'd recommend checking the pad before use, especially if you have pets, to remove any trapped debris in the surface, and we'll cover how to clean this pad later in this video. As for the hair tugging issue, I have rather hairy arms thanks to genetics, and I did notice some of my hair is getting caught occasionally in the surface, so if you have hairy arms or hands, I'd strongly recommend using an arm sleeve to prevent your hair from getting caught in the pad's surface. Another benefit to wearing an arm sleeve here when using this pad is that it keeps oils, dead skin, sweat, and other debris from your arms out of the pad's weaving, helping to prevent any debris related performance or discoloration issues on the pad's surface over long-term use. Now as I've said many times in this video already, using an arm sleeve with this pad is very beneficial, but because of the surface material and its unique roughness, not all arm sleeve types are compatible. Now compatible sleeves are ones that have a smooth texture surface and a good material blend, such as the Pulsar ES sleeve, the Skypad sleeve, the Hack sleeve, Focus Pro sleeve, and most gaming optimized sleeves. However, sleeves with textured surfaces or softer fabric blends are generally incompatible as they have a tendency to tug on the fabric pad surface, kind of like what arm hair does, creating high friction and inconsistent glide. So if you plan on using a sleeve with this pad, make sure you stick to a compatible one for the best experience. Lastly, for care and cleaning, as I mentioned earlier, because the pad's surface weaving, it's a good idea to inspect the pad before use and remove any debris that's gotten stuck inside the weaving. Now, if your surface needs to be cleaned, you can gently wipe it with a non-chemical or alcohol-free wet wipe. For a deeper clean, lukewarm water in a shower head can work, but since we don't know the fabric type used for the pad's surface material, exposure to large amounts of moisture could change how the pad feels, so generally avoid deep cleaning the pad as much as possible, and just spot cleaning the wet wipe is advised. And if you need to store or transport the pad, remember that you can't roll or crease the surface, so I highly recommend keeping the original packaging so you can safely store or move the pad without damaging it. And as a way to prevent debris from building up inside the pad's surface, I'd recommend repackaging the pad or at least covering it when you're not using it in an effort to shield the pad from debris buildup when it's not being used. Alright, in closing, the iCAN KLR-4924 is a surprisingly solid pad that retails for a great price, has great packaging and great performance, even if that performance profile doesn't really match a real Artisan Zero. But that said, this pad isn't perfect, as the pad is not using Poron or SlimFlex like advertised, as it has a rubber base, and while my unit had good build quality and QC, I do have concerns about consistency between batches, and I have some concerns about the longevity of the pad as well. On top of that, the surfacing material is unknown and it is slightly abrasive, so using an arm sleeve is highly recommended. The pad only comes in one firmness type and one size, and has limited compatibility with smaller surface area skates, and is very susceptible to dust, debris, and moisture. But all that said, for the price, this is a very good pad, but from an ethical point of view, it's kind of crazy to see a big box store like Canada Computers blatantly selling a clone of an Artisan Zero, something we've never seen before. So while this pad is worth considering, it doesn't perform the same as a real Zero, nor does it match the pad in terms of quality. But if you pick this pad up and enjoy it, I'd strongly encourage you to also buy a real Artisan Zero to support the people who actually developed the product, not a big box store selling a cheap clone of it. But with that, that's everything for today's episode of the mel0n Review. Thank you very much for watching, and big thank you to all of our channel members who make these videos possible. If you'd like to support these in-depth reviews, the Teardown Project, my guides, and in-depth product reviews, consider becoming a member here on YouTube, as it is the best way to directly support the channel, and all channel members get early access to all upcoming content. Thanks again for watching, and I'll catch you all in the next episode of the mel0n Review. Peace.